Get her off my stage. She's blind. She'll damage the Steinway. That was all it took. One public insult from a famous pianist, and the world almost missed a miracle. Aria Bellamy, a quiet, blind girl mocked in front of a crowd, said nothing in return. She simply sat at the piano, and when her fingers touched the keys, the world held its breath. What followed wasn't just music, it was a movement. This is the unforgettable story of how a girl with no sight, no fame, and no stage gave humanity something it had forgotten how to do. Listen. Now before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now let's get back to the story. Keep her away from the Steinway. This isn't a charity recital. The voice cracked through the concert hall like a whip, arrogant and sharp, slicing through the gentle hum of pre-show chatter. Gasps fluttered across the room as heads turned. At the center of it all, beneath the harsh glow of a crystal chandelier, a young girl stood motionless. She held a white cane loosely in one hand, and her other hand hovered in midair, just inches above the polished black surface of a grand piano. She did not flinch, she did not speak. But something in the set of her chin, delicate and steady, refused to yield. The man who had spoken, dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, stepped forward. Victor Bell. A name etched into classical music history, the kind of performer who could silence rooms with the press of a single key. His silver hair and icy blue eyes radiated command. People bowed when he entered spaces like this. His hands were insured for millions, and now those same hands pointed down, dismissively, at the girl before him. "She doesn't belong on that bench," he said, half to the stage manager, half to the dozens of elite guests already seated. "She's blind, for heaven's sake. She'll damage it." "Sir," came a tentative voice from behind the curtain, "she just asked to touch the keys. She's not even scheduled to." "I don't care," Victor barked. "You don't let a child play in traffic just because she wants to drive. Get her off my stage." The girl still hadn't moved. Her eyes, milky with clouded pupils, stared somewhere just past the piano. She looked younger than she was, 14, perhaps 15, but something about her presence defied fragility. Though her body was small and slender, her hands were elegant and long, the hands of someone meant to create sound. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Her voice floated across the stage like a leaf on still water. "I didn't mean to interrupt. No need to be dramatic." Victor replied coldly, already turning his back. "The world has enough sob stories." From the wings, someone recorded. A security guard, off-duty, phone halfway in his coat pocket. He hadn't meant to film, not really, but something about the girl's stillness made his thumb press record almost involuntarily. She stepped back, placing her cane in front of her again. There was no shaking in her hands, no moisture in her eyes. The hush in the room deepened. Not respectful silence, but that uncomfortable, sticky quiet that follows cruelty in public. People shifted in their seats. Someone coughed, a few whispered. Then she turned and walked away. Nobody knew her name. Not yet. 2 years earlier, Aria Bellamy had been just another invisible figure in the marble-lined corridors of Eastbrook Conservatory, the kind of place where students' surnames mattered more than their talents. Most of the students came from generational wealth. Ambassadors' children, retired ballet legends' sons, and daughters of global conductors. Aria came with nothing. No mother, no father. Just a plain caseworker who dropped her off at the campus gate and a single suitcase filled with threadbare clothes, a metronome with no battery, and a half-broken braille reader. The conservatory didn't technically admit her. She was there under a program called silent observership, a euphemism for keeping her far from stages or classrooms, but allowing her to soak up the inspiration. She soaked it up all right, from outside practice rooms through doors left ajar, from vibrations in the floorboards when pianists practiced upstairs. She spent her afternoons sitting cross-legged in the hallway outside Professor Alcott's lecture room, tracing music with her fingers in the air, every muscle in her hands twitching with invisible chords. It was Alcott who first noticed. At first, he dismissed it as a coincidence. But one evening, as the rain poured so loudly on the conservatory's arched glass roof that even practice became impossible, he saw her sitting there, hands suspended midair, eyes closed, following a silent rhythm. He leaned down. "Are you mimicking my lecture?" "I was trying," she said. "I'm sorry." "For what?" he asked. She hesitated. "For being here." Alcott blinked. The hallway smelled of old stone and varnished wood. Thunder growled outside. "Don't be sorry. Be precise," he said. From that day forward, when his students had gone and the lights dimmed low, Alcott stayed behind. He taught her not with printed scores, but with stories, describing the way a fugue should feel like chasing your own shadow, or how Debussy was like water running downhill, unpredictable, fluid, free. He pressed her fingers into wood to explain the weight of a chord, tapped out syncopations on her knuckles, hummed scales into her ear until she could feel pitch without hearing it. And Aria absorbed everything, with terrifying speed. But talent, in a place like Eastbrook, was not enough. When the conservatory announced its Young Virtuoso showcase, Alcott filled out the application for her himself. He didn't list her disability. He listed her name, her skill, and a private recommendation so glowing it bordered on a prayer. She was allowed to audition. Technically, her assigned time slot was 7:45 a.m., before most faculty had even arrived. The piano she was told to use was the old, slightly out-of-tune Baby Grand in the East rehearsal wing, not the concert Steinway. A single judge came to listen. No audience, no welcome. Aria sat in silence for a long time before placing her fingers on the keys. When she began to play, she didn't just reproduce music. She summoned it, transformed it. The piece, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, rose from the piano like a living thing, massive, aching, and unspeakably tender. When she was done, the judge nodded curtly and left without a word. She never received a callback. And Aria disappeared from the conservatory's halls. What she didn't know, what no one told her, was that someone had been watching. The janitor, who cleaned the wing every morning, had paused outside the door. He had heard what the judge heard. But unlike the judge, he was moved. That night, he uploaded the video he'd quietly taken, titled it, "Blind Girl Rejected by Conservatory Plays Rachmaninoff by Heart." The video didn't explode immediately, but a few days later, a piano blogger in Berlin reposted it, then a music therapist in Argentina, then a retired cellist in Brooklyn. The shares tripled by the hour. Comments poured in from every continent. "She plays like she's telling her own story," one wrote. "I felt that in my chest." The conservatory board panicked, not publicly, but behind closed doors, furious meetings were held. One particularly nervous administrator asked if they could track her IP address. Another reminded them that she didn't have an IP address. She didn't even own a phone. She was unreachable, until she wasn't. An envelope arrived at the conservatory's front desk, hand-delivered, gilded edges. From the International Gala of Human Harmony, a global concert broadcast to over 60 countries. This year's theme, Breaking Barriers in Sound. They wanted Aria Bellamy to open the show. The dean choked on his espresso. It wasn't a request, it was a declaration. A spotlight had been cast, and for the first time, Aria was no longer a hidden shadow in the back hallway. She would share the same stage as Victor Bell himself. And Victor did not take the news well. "She'll ruin the program's integrity." Victor's voice was low, calm, almost pleasant. Too calm, the way a winter wind can be quiet right before it bites. He spoke to the gala's director, an elderly man named Gérard Moreau, whose career had spanned every corner of global music diplomacy. The two were standing near the edge of the stage during a pre-rehearsal walkthrough in Vienna's Grande Harmonie Hall. "She's a child, blind, untrained. It's political. You know it is." Gérard raised an eyebrow. His French-accented voice carried just enough steel to remind Victor he wasn't speaking to a sycophant. "And yet, the world is waiting to hear her. Or haven't you seen the numbers?" Victor exhaled, sharp and slow. "This isn't a talent show." "No," Gérard replied, smiling faintly. "It's a reckoning." Somewhere across the city, Aria Bellamy stood barefoot in the quiet of her hotel suite. The floor beneath her toes was cool marble, veined like river branches frozen in time. She tilted her head slightly as she listened to the wind against the window, then to the silence between the gusts. Even in unfamiliar cities, she mapped her world through sound, the low growl of distant traffic, the high-pitched stutter of a faulty elevator 2 floors above, the tiny irregular tapping of a tree branch against the glass. It all fit together like an unspoken score. Professor Alcott had flown with her, despite no longer holding any official title. He refused to leave her side, even when the conservatory tried to replace him with a flashy manager. "You know," he'd whispered during the flight, "in all my years, I never imagined I'd be flying across the world with the finest pianist I ever taught, and one the school never admitted." Aria smiled softly. "They admitted my footsteps, that's something," he chuckled. "You always did play with the quiet kind of defiance." The rehearsal was scheduled for the following afternoon. Aria had not yet touched the piano, not since the day she'd walked off that stage. She hadn't dared, not because of fear, but because something inside her had shifted. Playing used to be her escape, her way of folding the world into melody when life refused to be kind. But now? Now the world wanted to listen. Not as background noise, not as indulgence, as truth. And the weight of that was immense. Still, when the moment came, when the doors to the rehearsal hall opened and the spotlight swept down from the rafters like a blade of light, she didn't hesitate. She stepped forward calmly, with Alcott at her side, until her fingers brushed the edge of the piano bench. It was the same make she'd always dreamed of, a Steinway D concert grand. The finish was cold, smooth, untouched. Her fingers trembled, just for a moment, then fell still. And then she sat. Every sound in the hall retreated. Even the dust seemed to pause. She placed her hands on the keys, but she didn't play. She simply held the silence in her palms, stretching it, commanding it, until it bent to her. And then, with a breath so quiet it barely belonged to her, she began. The notes that spilled out weren't from any known sonata or concerto. They didn't follow a familiar pattern. No famous composer had inked them centuries ago. They were hers, raw, unscored, born in that exact moment. A blend of memory and invention. She began with a single, sustained G, soft, uncertain, like a child reaching into a dark room. Then a ripple of triplets down the right hand, followed by a broken chord progression that sounded like sunlight filtered through grief. The left hand moved slowly, deliberately, more felt than heard. Those present, technicians, ushers, even the man fixing a rigging cable, stood frozen. No one gave a cue. No one dared interrupt. Even Victor, standing near the wings, had stopped mid-sentence when the music began. He didn't move. His eyes narrowed. There was something haunting about it. Something unsettling. She's not reading from anything, he thought. Not even muscle memory. This is pure invention. No one plays like this without being broken first. And then it dawned on him. She wasn't broken. He was. The melody morphed, a sudden shift, minor chords now, melancholy notes rising in wounded defiance. Her body leaned forward slightly as if pulled by invisible threads. Her face was serene, not joyful, not pained, just open, like a door left ajar during a storm. Then without warning she stopped, mid-chord. Her hands hovered. No resolution, no applause, just silence. And that silence thundered through the chamber like the aftermath of war. The rehearsal director stepped forward, stunned. "Miss Bellamy, will that be your piece for the gala?" She tilted her head, considering. "No," she said, "that was just a warm-up." Victor clenched his jaw. The next day, the gala director received a request from Victor Bell's agent. He wanted to change the performance order. Victor no longer wished to follow Aria's set. He wanted to open instead. The request was denied. Meanwhile, news of Aria's rehearsal leaked. Somehow, someone had taken a short audio clip on their phone and posted it to a classical music forum. The clip, just 45 seconds long, was shared over 3 million times in 12 hours. Headlines followed. The blind virtuoso who doesn't read music. The girl who silenced a concert hall. Rachmaninoff reincarnated? No, Bellamy begins. Victor spent the night in restless pacing. Not out of jealousy, not exactly, but fear. Not of her, but of something deeper. Of irrelevance. Of watching his legacy get eclipsed not by time, but by a girl who played with a kind of purity he hadn't touched in decades. He hadn't played from truth in so long he'd forgotten what it sounded like. And now, all he had was perfection. She had something else. On the morning of the gala, the Grand Harmonique Hall buzzed like a beehive of silk and diamonds. Diplomats, royalty, philanthropists, critics, and composers filled every velvet seat. The orchestra tuned beneath golden archways. Cameras were locked in. Backstage, Victor warmed up alone. His fingers danced over the keys with practiced flair. Every note exact, every tempo obeyed. He didn't realize that just one room over, Aria sat with her fingers on her lap, doing nothing but breathing. Listening, mapping the resonance of the concert hall by its breathing. feeling the vibrations from the floor as the audience shuffled in. She didn't need sight, she could feel the weight of thousands. Professor Alcott stood beside her quietly, holding her cane. "Are you afraid?" he whispered. She shook her head gently. "No," she said. "I've already played my hardest song. This one is just truth." He smiled. "Then give it to them." She nodded, then stood. A stagehand opened the side curtain. It was time. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice boomed across the opulent auditorium, "please welcome to the stage Aria Bellamy." A ripple of curiosity ran through the audience. Some leaned forward, brows raised. Others tilted their heads toward their programs, flipping pages to find the unfamiliar name. A few whispered to their neighbors. Most had never heard of her. Those who had seen the viral video from weeks before now sat motionless, anticipation bubbling under their skin like a drawn breath that couldn't be released. The house lights dimmed. A single beam of warm gold spilled down from the rafters onto the stage, illuminating the grand Steinway that stood like a monolith of sound waiting to be awakened. And then she appeared. Not in a dramatic entrance, no fanfare, no sweeping dress, just Aria. Barefoot, in a simple black gown, one hand gently resting on Professor Alcott's arm, the other loosely holding her white cane. The audience watched in reverent silence as she approached the piano, her steps slow, deliberate, but without a hint of fear. Her head turned slightly as she counted the spacing. Alcott guided her gently to the bench, then stepped back into the shadows like a guardian who had fulfilled his purpose. Aria sat. For a moment, she didn't move. Her hands lay in her lap, and her head bowed, not in submission but in communion, like a priest before the altar, or a soldier before the storm. The silence became sacred. And then, barely audible, she inhaled. Her fingers rose and hovered, and they began to play. But what came wasn't a recognizable prelude. Not Chopin, not Beethoven, not Bach. No one in the audience could name it, because it had no name. It was something else, something older than sheet music, deeper than memory. It was a story. The right hand fluttered in ripples across the upper register, delicate notes that danced like raindrops skipping across glass. They were playful, hesitant, childlike. The left hand joined a moment later, slow and rich, anchoring the melody with the gravity of a father's absence, a mother's voice lost in time. Those in the audience who had seen hardship felt it instantly. The trembling start, the notes stumbling, searching, then suddenly finding clarity. A rising scale that soared, briefly triumphant, then collapsed again into minor keys that sounded like unanswered prayers. It was not a performance, it was remembrance. A sigh from the front row broke the air. An ambassador's wife dabbed her cheek with the corner of her glove. A young violinist in the balcony leaned so far forward that his glasses fell from his face and clattered onto the floor below, but no one shushed him, no one moved. Because now Aria's tempo shifted. The chords thickened. Her fingers struck the keys with unexpected power, percussive bursts that thundered like fists pounding against a locked door. Her entire body moved with the sound, shoulders tight, spine bowed. The rhythm became defiant, angry, alive. This was no longer just memory. It was resistance. The music seemed to cry out, "I was never given a chance. You looked past me. You shut your doors, but I am still here." Each crescendo struck like a confession. Each diminuendo left a vacuum, drawing the crowd in closer. Even Victor, watching from the green room through a live monitor, had frozen mid-step. He had one hand on the tuning keys of his own piano, but he wasn't touching them now. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes narrowed. She had no sheet, no orchestra, no conductor. And yet, she commanded every soul in the room like a maestro. Halfway through the piece, Aria slowed. Her left hand dropped out entirely, and with her right she began a single melody, a simple, wistful sequence in E major. It drifted upward, climbing as if trying to touch the stars. She repeated it. Once, twice, and then she changed it. Just slightly, a single note bent downward, another skipped entirely, and suddenly those listening understood. This was her mother's lullaby. Untrained ears couldn't tell, but those with childhoods full of soft singing, of gentle rocking under moonlight, recognized it at once. And it shattered them. The notes faded. The hall was utterly still. Aria held the final chord so lightly it was almost a breath, then released it into nothing. No motion, no bow. She sat with her hands on her knees, facing the audience without seeing them, but knowing exactly what she'd left in their chests. And then the thunder came. Applause erupted like a dam bursting. It wasn't polite. It was primal. Chairs scraped backward. Some stood, others shouted. There were tears in places that had not known weeping in decades. The ovation rolled like a wave, sweeping the room in a fever of awe and disbelief. Cameras panned from face to face, critics, conductors, heads of state, each with expressions torn wide open. A voice cried from the balcony, "Encore!" Another followed, "Aria, Aria!" She didn't rise. She didn't react. She simply turned her face upward toward the lights, as if listening to the sound not with her ears but with her skin. Backstage, Victor turned from the monitor and poured himself a drink with shaking hands. "They won't remember me tonight," he muttered. "They'll remember her." He wasn't wrong. In the hours that followed, the gala's live stream shattered viewership records. News outlets scrambled for a name. Social media exploded with clips, commentary, tributes. Composers posted reaction videos. Critics published emergency editorials, calling her performance a once-in-a-century expression of the human spirit. By morning, Aria Bellamy's name was the top trending search in over 20 countries, and she had no idea. In her quiet hotel room, far from the glow of fame, Aria sat cross-legged on the carpet, her hands resting in her lap. Professor Alcott sat across from her, his cup of tea untouched. "Was it enough?" she asked softly. He leaned forward, voice low and reverent. "You didn't just play music, Aria. You changed its shape." She tilted her head. "But I didn't finish the story." He smiled. "No, because now the world will be asking for more." "Aria Bellamy?" The voice was nervous, breathless, as the man jogged down the marble hallway toward her. She had only just stepped into the side exit of the concert hall, the last embers of applause still echoing faintly in the air behind her. Her cane tapped softly against the ground as she paused, turning her head slightly. Alcott, ever at her side, stepped forward instinctively to shield her. But the man stopped a few respectful feet away. "My name's Anthony Liu," he said. "I'm with Deutsche Harmonia Records. We just saw your performance and—" "I don't even have words." Aria nodded slowly. She heard his heartbeat in his throat. Fast, honest, not rehearsed. "I don't know what your management situation is," he stammered, "but we'd like to discuss signing you. Global tour, exclusive rights to produce your first studio album. Anything you want. Name it." Aria said nothing. Her fingers quietly twisted the thin silk tassel on the end of her cane. The wind moved faintly through the corridor's stained glass windows. Alcott raised his hand gently. "She'll speak when she's ready." And she did. But it wasn't the answer Anthony expected. "Do you know what the word prelude means?" she asked softly. Anthony blinked. It means, well, the beginning, right? It means an introduction to something larger, something that hasn't happened yet." She turned her head back toward the echoing auditorium behind them. Tonight wasn't the story. It was just the prelude. The man stood frozen, his business card slipping slightly in his hand, forgotten. By the next morning, a flurry of other offers followed. Every label, every symphony, private invitations from cultural ministries, royal patrons, heads of major conservatories. Some offered money, others offered entire stages in her name, and yet Aria answered none of them. She sat with Professor Alcott on the train to Salzburg, where a quiet retreat awaited her. She requested a cabin with no screens, no noise-canceling insulation, only windows that opened, so she could hear the wind and the passing countryside. As the landscape rolled by, she pressed her palm against the glass and whispered, "They want me to play songs I haven't lived yet." Alcott smiled faintly. "You've always played from your scars, but now, maybe it's time to play from your healing." Back at the conservatory, Victor Bell remained behind. He had not spoken publicly since the gala. His agent issued a carefully worded statement about artistic reflection and respecting new voices in the musical world. But behind the scenes, Victor sat in the masterclass wing, watching replays of Aria's performance on an old analog monitor, the digital buffer removed so he could rewind by feel. He didn't speak as he watched. He only listened, over and over again, and each time a different note stabbed deeper. Because there were things Aria played that he'd once understood. Before the fame, before the pressure, before the perfection, before every note had to be clean and every smile timed to curtain calls. He had forgotten how to bleed into the keys. Aria hadn't. She'd never had a choice. The conservatory scrambled to rewrite its policies. Donations poured in with conditions: create accessible programs, open blind auditions, fund scholarships for non-traditional students. What had been a hidden rot in their culture was now a cracked open wound bleeding into the public. And Aria? She was silent. Weeks passed. The offers kept coming. One morning, Alcott found her at a small upright piano in the village cafe near their Salzburg retreat, playing for no one in particular. A child sat cross-legged nearby, tracing the floor tiles with a toy car. An old man read the newspaper, not even realizing who she was. She played anyway. Not for applause, not for record deals, for the story. A reporter tracked her down eventually, young, persistent, respectful. She asked Aria if she could record a short segment for a documentary. Aria hesitated but agreed, only if they filmed the piano, not her face. "I don't want this to be about me," she said. "I want people to hear themselves in the music." "But your story matters," the reporter insisted. "You've broken barriers." Aria smiled gently. "No, I've just reminded people that silence doesn't mean absence." That clip alone garnered 10 million views. Among those who saw it was a teenage girl in rural Texas, deaf since birth, who had always been told music wasn't for her. After watching Aria, she began experimenting with haptic sound gloves, mapping rhythm through touch. She sent Aria a letter written in Braille with the help of her sister. It ended with, "You made space for me." Aria held the letter for a long time. Then, for the first time since the gala, she sat to compose again. The new piece came to her not in a storm, but in a whisper. It began with a simple phrase, 3 notes, no more, repeated with minor variation. She built around it slowly, layering intervals like vines curling around a trellis. This time, it was not sorrowful, nor angry, nor desperate. It was thankful. When she played it for Alcott, he closed his eyes halfway through and turned his face away, not to hide tears, but to honor the moment. "You've written a bridge," he said softly when she finished. She looked puzzled. "A bridge? Between who you were and who you've become." She titled the piece Sightlines. It was played for the first time in a modest chamber hall in Paris, not announced in advance, just a quiet performance for 100 guests. No live stream, no press, just sound. And those who were lucky enough to be there never forgot it. They said it felt like finding a path in the dark and realizing you had known the way all along. "Miss Bellamy, are you aware you've just been nominated for the Artisan Prize?" The voice on the phone was jittery with excitement, like it had been waiting hours for this moment. Aria sat quietly in the corner of a sun-drenched garden in Florence, her cane laid across her lap like a sleeping bird. Bees danced lazily through the lavender. The breeze rustled the hem of her dress as if it, too, wanted her attention. She didn't answer right away. The word prize always felt like a foreign thing to her, as if it were meant for other people. People with medals in glass cases, framed degrees, or families who saved front-row seats at their recitals. "I've never competed," she said gently. "Not really." "It's not a competition," the voice replied. "It's recognition." Aria tilted her head, listening to the distant bells of a cathedral strike the hour. Her fingers ran along the braille etching on the notebook beside her, a collection of half-finished melodies, scattered like rain. Her answer came not as a declaration, but a murmur. "Then let the music speak. That's all I've ever wanted." News of the nomination made headlines within hours. The Artisan Prize, given only once a decade to a musician whose work fundamentally reshaped the human understanding of sound, had never before been offered to someone so young, nor to someone blind, nor to someone who had never formally graduated from a conservatory. But none of that mattered anymore, because the world had already begun to change in her echo. Children in forgotten neighborhoods were being handed keyboards by volunteers instead of plastic guns. Entire orchestras reviewed their audition processes. Braille sheet music requests surged globally. Music schools once cold to difference now scrambled to embrace it. She never asked for this. She never sought to be a symbol. But she was becoming one anyway. Meanwhile, back in Eastbrook, the hallways that had once hummed with silent judgment now carried a different tone. Professor Alcott had returned, this time not as a lecturer, but as the newly appointed director of inclusive curriculum. It was a title no one had imagined a year ago, and one the board had been practically shamed into creating after alumni and donors pulled support. But Alcott didn't care how it came about. He cared only that the door, once slammed in Aria's face, was finally open for others like her. On the door to his new office hung a simple plaque. For the students who listen in silence, we hear you now. And Victor? He stayed behind long after the rest had moved on. He performed less, traveled even less. But something in him had shifted, quiet and gradual, like ice melting beneath spring soil. He began composing again, not for an audience but for himself. Not flawless, sweeping symphonies but raw, intimate pieces, sometimes only a few minutes long, and every one began the same way, with silence. Then a single note. Just like she had taught him. One morning, Victor surprised the faculty by requesting to audit a class. Not teach, learn. He sat in the back row of a beginner's improvisation course, surrounded by students 3 generations younger than him, scribbling rhythms in a worn notebook. I never learned how to feel my way through music, he admitted to the class one day. Only how to dominate it. But I've met someone who listens better than I ever did. The students listened, and in them, he heard something he hadn't in years: grace. Half a world away, Aria stood on the shoreline of a quiet bay in Nova Scotia, where the waves whispered secrets in rhythms only she seemed to understand. She didn't tour, she didn't chase venues. Instead, she traveled like a wind that chose its own direction, small town to city, chapel to community center, leaving behind fragments of music like footsteps in sand. She was never alone. Word spread long before her arrival. People didn't come just to hear her play. They came to hear her listen. Sometimes she didn't play at all. Sometimes she invited others to sit at the piano with her. Children, elders, those too afraid to touch the keys. She'd guide their hands gently, and together they'd create something no one had written before. She called it shared sound. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about being heard. In one such session, a boy with a stutter sat trembling beside her, afraid to touch the keys. "I'll ruin it," he whispered. She smiled. "There's nothing here to ruin, only to reveal." He played a single note, then another. By the end of that afternoon, he'd composed a 4-bar melody that would go on to be featured in a youth mental health campaign. And when asked later why he thought Aria had chosen him, he answered simply, "She saw me, without ever seeing me." Letters came by the hundreds, from mothers, from ex-musicians, from inmates, from school teachers. Many ended with the same line: "You reminded me I was still music." Aria never responded with words. She responded with compositions, each handwritten, each built from a line in the letter, each returned without fanfare. A mother who lost her child to cancer received a piece titled "The Breath You Left Behind." An ex-convict who found solace in rhythm received "Forgiven Tempo." A man with dementia who could no longer recall his wife's name was sent "Theme of the Forgotten Heart." She kept no record of these pieces, no copies. They belonged only to the people who wrote to her. She believed music was a gift, not a transaction. And still, she refused interviews, awards, talk shows, spotlights. But her absence only made her presence more mythic. The Artisan Prize ceremony approached. It would be held at the Royal Hall in London, a room carved of gold and ghostlight, echoing with the footsteps of centuries of greats. It was to be broadcast to 94 countries. A marble podium, flanked by velvet banners, waited center stage. The chair reserved for Aria remained respectfully empty for most of the evening. Until, minutes before the final presentation, the back doors creaked open. She entered, not with a team, not with guards, just with Alcott, a violin case in one hand, her cane in the other. She did not walk straight to the stage. She walked to the side and sat among the audience. When they called her name, applause rose in a tidal wave. She stood slowly and bowed, not to accept the prize, but to honor the people in the room who had lived quietly, fought gently, and never been heard. And then she spoke, into a single microphone. "I have no speech," she said, "but I brought a voice." She opened the violin case and pulled out a simple wooden flute. It had belonged to her mother, and as she raised it to her lips, the room held its breath. And then, she played. A melody without ego, without polish, just breath, just truth. And in that truth, the world was silenced again. The first note rose like mist, soft, delicate, ancient. It curled into the rafters of the Royal Hall, finding its way into corners that even chandeliers had forgotten. The audience sat frozen, not from reverence, but from something more sacred: recognition. This wasn't just a song. It was an arrival. The sound of something unburied, a whisper from the soul's edge. Aria stood alone, the wooden flute steady in her hands, her eyes closed not from blindness, but from devotion. Each breath she gave into the instrument carried stories no words had ever held. She played not like a performer, but like a witness, someone who had stood in silence for years and finally found the breath to speak. The melody was simple, yet it wandered, a question that answered itself. A yearning stretched into sound. People forgot to blink, to breathe. Some wept without realizing it. Others held the hands of strangers. The piece lasted just under 5 minutes, and when it ended, she lowered the flute slowly, as if not to disturb the silence it had created. She bowed her head, and she left the stage. No speech, no declaration, not even a glance toward the award still gleaming untouched on the velvet-covered pedestal. It didn't matter. The room rose around her, a standing ovation born not of protocol, but of something wordless and primal. Even the most jaded critics didn't dare open their mouths. For once, silence was enough. Outside, the night hung heavy and blue, like a velvet curtain draped across the city. Aria walked with Professor Alcott down a narrow, cobbled street lit only by the occasional gas lamp. Her cane clicked softly with each step, echoing off old stone buildings that had heard centuries of secrets. They asked again if you'll accept the award, Alcott said gently. Aria tilted her head. Does music need a medal to matter? He smiled. No, but sometimes the world needs a mirror to see what it's become. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned toward a low, wrought iron fence behind which lay a tiny park, bare trees silhouetted in the moonlight, a single bench beneath an archway of ivy. Can we sit? She asked. They did. She placed the flute across her lap and lifted her face toward the night. I played that song for her, she said at last. Alcott knew who she meant. He didn't interrupt. I remember her hum more than her words. She used to sing while folding laundry, or brushing my hair. Little half-melodies that never resolved. I never knew the names of them. I don't think they had names. He listened. I used to think I lost her when I lost my sight, that the colors faded first and then her voice. She turned slightly, hands folding over the flute. But maybe I was just waiting for the right silence, one where I could hear her again. Alcott rested his hand on hers. You gave her a second life tonight. They sat like that for a long time, the cold brushing their cheeks like a memory. The next morning, Aria's performance made headlines around the globe. But this time, the stories didn't focus on her blindness, or the tragedy of her childhood, or the accolades. They focused on something else, a stillness, a reminder. One headline read, "She played 5 minutes, the world stopped for 10. Another, "The note that taught us to listen again." And another, "No lights, no fireworks, just breath, just truth." She had not accepted the Artisan Prize, but the foundation that awarded it made an unprecedented decision. They renamed the award itself. Henceforth it would be called the Aria Bellamy Honor, not as a prize, but as a promise to hear what the world once refused to listen to. Months passed. Aria vanished from the public eye again, retreating into a rhythm of quiet villages, handwritten compositions, and soft teaching moments. She never posted, never advertised. But she was never forgotten. One winter morning in a small mountain town nestled in the Pyrenees, she was found at the community library, teaching a 7-year-old boy with autism how to feel music through vibrations in his feet. She lined small brass bowls with sand, taught him to strike them gently, then press his soles to the wood floor and wait. He didn't speak, but when she played beside him, he smiled. Later that day, he took her hand and tapped out his own melody on her palm. She played it back instantly. He laughed, and it was the first time his mother had heard him laugh in months. Aria never mentioned it, but a teacher from that town wrote about it in a small blog post, which quietly went viral. The subject line read, "She never told us who she was, but she left behind music that made the snow feel warmer." In places she never visited, murals appeared, not of her face, but of her hands. Outstretched, playing invisible notes, on school walls, subway stations, refugee tents. People had begun using her compositions to process grief, to celebrate healing, to bridge silence where words had failed. And slowly, a new phrase emerged in the lexicon of music education. Play like Aria. It didn't mean perfection. It meant presence. It meant truth. It meant listening so deeply that the music wasn't something you played. It was something you remembered. Back at Eastbrook Conservatory, a new wing was under construction. Glass walls, natural acoustics, accessible from every direction. It would be called the Bellamy Wing for sonic exploration. But the only words etched into the entrance would be hers. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of everything waiting to be heard. One day, years later, a young girl wandered into a quiet corner of a music library in Lisbon. She was blind like Aria had been, and carried a recorder she'd made from an old garden hose and a rusted flute mouthpiece. She wasn't famous. She wasn't known. But tucked into the sleeve of one of the archive's Braille scores, she found a slip of paper. It was a handwritten melody. No name, no date, just 7 notes. She played them and began to cry. Not because it was sad, but because someone somewhere had left her a voice. And in that moment she knew. Aria had passed by, and the world still echoed with her breath. The sun hovered low over the horizon, brushing the sea with the kind of amber light that made the world seem hushed. In a weather-worn coastal village in northern Iceland, tucked between black cliffs and windswept grass, Aria sat in the back room of a local cafe, her hands resting over the rim of a piano older than the cafe itself, the keys stuck in places. Some were yellowed, others chipped, but it sang. And that, she once said, was enough. A dozen people gathered around. No cameras, no announcements. They had come not because of who she was, but because of what they had heard. A fisherman's daughter said she once heard a song that made her father cry for the first time since her mother died. A woman who worked the bakery across the street brought warm bread, not as payment, but as reverence. The door stayed open. The cold air rolled in and out with the tides. Aria didn't introduce herself. She asked each person what sound reminded them of home. Some said the crackle of firewood, others the hum of old fridges. One man smiled and said, "The silence of snow before it lands." She nodded, and without speaking further, she played. She took their sounds and gave them shape. She built music from memory, not hers but theirs. She bent the notes to carry their weight. Her left hand struck a pattern like a hearth's heartbeat. Her right, a rolling echo like snow melting on tin rooftops. People didn't clap. They breathed. After the final note faded, she reached for the bread with both hands, her smile quiet and complete. And the villagers would tell the story for years after, not about a famous pianist, but about a girl who came, asked about home, and turned their answers into sound. Meanwhile, in cities she would never return to, the legacy of her silence deepened. Universities began developing courses not in composition, but in listening. Programs popped up for invisible musicians, those with no traditional training, those who played on borrowed instruments, those who used rhythm to survive rather than perform. In the Bronx, a subway violinist named Camille was invited to speak at the World Music Symposium after citing Aria as the reason he finally recorded his first album. "I thought music needed to be loud to matter," he said to the crowd of thousands. "But she showed me you could whisper and still move mountains." In Johannesburg, a girl built a listening dome out of broken wind chimes and rainwater pipes after hearing Aria's story. She called it a house for forgotten sound. When asked if she'd ever met Aria, she shook her head and replied, "No one meets her. You feel her." And deep within the Amazon, in a village untouched by modern orchestras but not untouched by pain, an elder strung vines across hollowed logs and began teaching rhythm to children orphaned by conflict. He named the rhythm Bellamy Pulse. The world was no longer merely echoing her name. It was reshaping around her silence. Yet Aria remained unaware of most of it. She didn't carry a phone. She didn't read the articles. She didn't follow her influence like a shadow. She followed music and let the rest follow her. In late autumn, she traveled to Kyoto, staying in a monastery that echoed with bells and the rustle of bamboo. The monks said she arrived during the softest rain they had ever heard. She never asked for shelter, only for a quiet place to hear her own thoughts. Each day she walked the temple gardens barefoot, leaves gathering between her toes, the gravel crunching beneath each step like memory. In the evenings she played for the monks, not with flair but with reverence. She used the sound of the wind through paper walls, the drip of water in stone basins, the creak of century-old floorboards, and turned them into symphonies of stillness. One monk, nearly blind himself, wept as she played. "I never believed I'd hear someone speak in the language I dream in," he whispered. They gave her a small bell as a gift when she left. It made almost no sound, just a faint shimmer when moved, like a ghost brushing wind chimes. She wore it on her wrist from then on. Back in Eastbrook, the conservatory had changed beyond recognition. Once the symbol of silent elitism, it was now a sanctuary of rediscovery. A new generation of students flooded in, not to compete, but to create, not to perform, but to tell the truth. A freshman named Elijah, who had once been mute from trauma, now composed for the entire student orchestra. A girl who had grown up without books taught advanced rhythm using only her feet. Their motto, hung above the grand staircase, read, "Music is not what we play. It's what we allow ourselves to feel." And in a glass case near the entrance, untouched, gleamed the very flute Aria had played the night of the Artisan Prize. Donated anonymously, with a note beneath it, "Let someone else borrow the voice for a while." One spring morning, years after that night in London, Aria returned to the city not for a concert but for a child. A little girl named Luma. 6 years old, blind since birth, diagnosed with an auditory disorder that made traditional music unbearable, too loud, too sharp, too violent. Her parents had written to every music therapist they could find. Most said the same thing: maybe music just isn't for her. But then one therapist, old and quiet, said, "There's someone who might know how to help. She doesn't answer phones. She doesn't live anywhere. But if you write your story into music, she may come." So they did. A melody, just 4 notes, sent by post. And one morning, Aria arrived. She didn't knock. She sat outside their door on the steps, flute in hand, and began to play. Not outward, but inward, into the cracks of the stone, into the breath of the home, into the silence where Luma sat curled in her room, hands over her ears. And slowly, Luma removed her hands, stepped out, 1 foot at a time, and sat beside the woman who didn't speak, didn't explain, just played. A melody built for her, shaped by her, designed not to overwhelm, but to embrace. Luma cried, then touched the flute, then laughed, and a new song was born that no one but the two of them would ever understand. Years later, when Luma became a sound artist known for crafting immersive musical gardens, she would say, "I never learned to love music. I learned that music already loved me. She taught me that." And still, Aria moved quietly through the world, not seeking monuments, not chasing legacy, but leaving behind footsteps of sound, too soft to notice unless you were listening with your soul. And those who truly listened, who really listened, began to notice the places she'd been, like fingerprints pressed into wind. A library in Peru, where no book had words, only tones. A bridge in Italy that sang when walked across barefoot. A music box in a Ghanaian orphanage that played different songs depending on who opened it. She was never there for the unveiling, but the music always knew. It always carried her breath, her touch, her truth. And so, the girl who was once mocked by a famous pianist, who was told she'd never touch a Steinway, never play for a real audience, didn't just silence the world. She taught it to listen. The wind moved gently through the hollow of the desert, brushing across the cracked earth like the whisper of a forgotten name. Somewhere far from cities, in a land of red sand and distant horizon, Aria sat beneath the open sky with her back resting against the sun-warmed stone. No stage, no audience. Just silence, as endless and wide as the stars preparing to rise. She had come here without telling anyone. No train schedule, no festival invitation. Only a letter she had received months earlier. A letter written by a boy from the Dene Nation who had carved his words into the back of a broken drumhead. It said, "There's a sound here we've forgotten how to listen for. Can you help us remember?" She carried no instrument, only the bell around her wrist and the shape of his words echoing inside her. By evening, the village gathered. They came barefoot, wrapped in woven shawls, led by grandmothers who had once sung lullabies to the wind. There were no chairs, no microphone. Only the crackle of a small fire and the hush of expectation waiting to become song. Aria stood slowly and faced them, not by sight but by sound. She could hear the difference in how each person breathed, who shifted, who held still. She could hear the nervous foot tapping of the boy who'd written her, his heart stuttering like a skip beat. She knelt and pressed her palms into the ground. The people waited. She didn't speak. Instead, she began to hum, A low, steady tone, no words, no melody, just breath. Then, one by one, others joined in. An elder drummed softly with a carved stick. A girl rattled a necklace of shells. Someone began tapping two stones together, slow at first, then faster. The desert, ancient and wide, seemed to listen too. And in that moment, the people remembered. They remembered that music didn't come from radios or polished halls or written scores. It came from them. From stories carried in bones, from the ache in their ancestors' silence, from laughter shared beside dying fires, from the rhythm of walking the same earth generation after generation. Aria had come to give them music. But in truth, she had only come to remind them they already had it. When the night was over, the boy approached her. He held the broken drumhead in both hands, trembling slightly. "It doesn't make sound anymore," he said. She took it gently and traced the edges with her fingers. "Then maybe it remembers silence better than any of us." He looked at her, wide-eyed. "Can I learn to make it sing again?" She nodded, smiling. Not with sound, but with story. And she left him with the only word he needed: begin. The next day, she was gone. No goodbye, just echoes. As the years rolled on, Aria's name became less a name and more a feeling. In academic journals, her influence was studied not through her compositions, but through the ripple effect of them. Music therapists called it the Bellamy shift, a movement from perfection to presence, a way of playing that placed emotion before execution. In war zones, humanitarian workers used her melodies to reach children who had forgotten how to speak. In elderly homes, memory care specialists found that even patients deep in dementia recognized her songs, tapping along with their fingertips as if the music had always been a part of them, waiting in some quiet room of the mind. And in courtrooms, her story was used as a case study in disability advocacy, showing the power of opportunity versus exclusion. One lawyer famously quoted her during a civil rights hearing, "You don't need to see to be a mirror, you only need to reflect the truth." But Aria never returned to those conversations. She didn't read the articles. She didn't sit for documentaries. When an international committee tried to award her a Lifetime Achievement honor, she declined, with a note written in faint ink on hand paper. "Lifetime doesn't mean end. I'm still listening." She wandered from country to country, sometimes appearing in the most unexpected places. A remote monastery in Tibet, a vineyard in southern Chile, a rooftop in Mumbai, where she played a lullaby for a street child's birthday. She never stayed longer than the music did. But the world began to sense her presence before she arrived, not through announcements but through coincidence. Suddenly, a forgotten piano would be tuned, a classroom would fall quiet, a choir of strangers would gather without plan, as if drawn by a sound they couldn't quite hear but had always known. One winter in Prague, during the coldest night of the year, a woman in her 90s sat alone in a public square beside a frozen fountain. She was clutching a photograph of her brother, lost decades ago in the war. She hadn't spoken in days. Then a girl with dark braids and a flute walked by and sat beside her. She played a melody made of snowflakes and ash, and the old woman began to hum. She spoke her brother's name, and for the first time in 60 years, she smiled. No one recorded it. No one published it. But someone told someone else, and that's how the story grew. Not in headlines, but in hearts. Back in Eastbrook, Professor Alcott, now old and silver-haired, sat by the lake near the conservatory gardens, reading a letter from a child in Nairobi who had built a violin from spare wood and used his knees to hold it steady because he had no arms. He had written, "I heard her once, on a tape someone left behind. I don't remember the tune. I remember the way it made me stop crying." Alcott looked out across the water, wind lifting the corner of his coat. He whispered aloud, "She's everywhere, isn't she?" The willow trees said nothing, but the breeze answered. Some say Aria returned to the hall in Vienna once more, decades after her first gala, not to perform, but to listen. She sat in the farthest seat in the balcony, her hair streaked with gray now, the bell on her wrist worn smooth from time. On stage, a child of 7, a blind girl from Morocco, took the bench. And when she played, Aria tilted her head slightly and smiled. The girl didn't know who was watching, but afterward she found a single folded note placed on the piano lid. It read, "You heard the world, and the world heard you." And that was all. Years from now, when people try to remember the woman named Aria Bellamy, Some will argue she was the greatest pianist of her time. Others will say she was a teacher, a healer, a ghost who turned silence into song. But the ones who truly listened, they'll say she was a bridge. A bridge between the seen and unseen, the heard and the silenced, the wound and the wonder. And when her name is spoken, it will not be shouted. It will be whispered, like the first note of a melody not yet written. The sea sang to her in languages only her heart understood. Somewhere along the jagged cliffs of Portugal's western edge, Aria sat at the threshold of land and water, the Atlantic breathing against stone in long, mournful sighs. She had been here for days or maybe weeks. Time didn't matter anymore. She didn't keep calendars, didn't count down days to performances. Her rhythms were the tides now, the wind, the echo of footsteps in soft sand. A small wooden recorder lay beside her, not a grand flute, not an instrument of fame, just a modest, hand-carved thing left to her by a child in Peru, etched with uneven grooves and a tiny heart scratched near the mouthpiece. It made a thin, reedy sound, fragile and imperfect. She loved it. Her fingers traced its body like a prayer, not because she was about to play, but because she wasn't ready to yet. Not until the story was ready to be told. Behind her, a boy approached. 12, maybe. Freckles on his cheeks, a fishing line looped around his shoulder. He didn't speak right away. She heard him hesitate, shift his weight, breathe nervously through his nose. "I didn't think you were real," he finally said. She smiled, eyes still turned to the sea. "Neither did I." He stepped beside her. Sat down, careful and quiet. "You don't look like a legend," she chuckled softly. "That's the secret. Legends are just people waited long enough to become myths." He was silent for a while, thinking that over. "My dad died last year," he said. "He used to play guitar, not fancy, just old folk songs. I hated it, thought it was boring." Aria said nothing. "But after he died, I missed it more than anything else. Not the songs, just the sound, even the out-of-tune parts." He looked down, rubbed a seashell between his fingers. "Now when I try to play," he whispered, "it just hurts." She turned toward him, her face calm as dusk. "That's when it means something." He looked at her, confused. "If it hurts," she said, "it means the music still remembers." She held out the recorder. He hesitated. "I don't know how." "No one does," she said, "until they listen." He took it, hands trembling, and blew into it gently. A squeak, then a breathy hum, then a note, broken and thin. But there, she didn't correct him. She smiled, placed her hand on the rock between them and whispered, "He'd be proud of that note." The boy didn't speak, but he kept playing, and the sun dipped low. Elsewhere, in rooms far more gilded, the world was still speaking her name. The UN had named her a cultural envoy without ever having heard her accept a title. Educational systems cited her in curriculum guides. Journalists called her the sole architect of a generation. Conservatories installed tactile music labs in her honor. But Aria never responded, not because she was distant, but because she was present in the places where no one else bothered to look. A refugee camp in Lebanon, where she played lullabies through the walls of nylon tents. A hospital in Buenos Aires, where she composed a 3-note motif for every child who passed from this world, so their mothers could hum them back into memory. An alley in Seoul where she left sheet music pinned to telephone poles with notes that read, "Play this and pass it on." She wasn't touring, she was tracing the world with sound, and people began to follow. Not to watch, but to continue. She had sparked something deeper than performance, an unspoken movement. In France, it became known as l'écoute libre, the free listening. In Kenya, they called it nyimbo ya moyo, songs of the heart. In Canada, it was simply the Aria way. Thousands of unnamed musicians began performing in places where no one expected music. Nursing homes, stairwells, long-distance buses, abandoned churches. They played not for applause, but for connection. They wore no uniforms, held no microphones. Their only shared mark was a tiny circle, drawn in chalk or thread or ink, meant to represent an ear, always listening. No central organization, no leader. Just music, whispered from soul to soul. And through it all, Aria remained a wanderer. She carried nothing but the wind and a notebook of braille-stamped pages filled not with lyrics, but with sensations. Smell of oranges in a Sicilian market, pigeons pacing on the rooftop, gravel under a child's ballet shoes. Each entry was a beginning. Each note, a fragment of some unfinished, unwritten symphony of the world. One early morning in Copenhagen, she passed a man crying in a park. He didn't look up, she didn't speak. She just sat on the next bench and began to tap a slow rhythm against the wooden slats. 4 beats, pause, 4 beats, pause. Eventually he began to tap back. 3 beats, then silence, then 4. She adjusted, matched his pattern, and so the two of them composed a silent duet in a city just waking up. 2 strangers who would never know each other's names. But something between them broke and then mended in rhythm. By the time he stood to leave, he placed a flower beside her. She never looked up, but she smelled it and kept tapping. Stories like these began to spread in a way no PR campaign ever could. Not because they were printed, but because they were lived. If you asked 10 people where they last heard Aria Bellamy, you'd hear 10 different cities, 10 different sounds. In Rio, she played spoons on a food stall counter. In Cairo, she taught blind children to map notes with their feet. In Alaska, she played to glaciers that answered back with their cracks. Each place changed her, and each place she changed in return. But not once did she take credit. She only listened, then played, then left. As the years passed, her hair silvered, her steps slowed, but her presence grew brighter, like the final glow of coals before dawn. And then one day she stopped. Not suddenly, not dramatically. She simply sat in a village garden in Laos, placed her cane beside her, and told a little girl who had been following her with wide, curious eyes, "It's your turn now." The girl asked, "To do what?" "To hear." And when the girl asked what she should listen for, Aria placed her hand over the child's chest and whispered, "Start here." That night, Aria played her final piece. No audience, no cameras, just the wind, the crickets, and a river bending through the trees. It was not grand. It was not loud. It was the sound of a life arriving at peace. And when the sun rose, she was gone, not mourned, but remembered, in breath, in stillness, in every place where music once waited for permission and now flowed freely. The woman who was mocked for daring to touch the piano, the girl who played without sight but saw what no one else could, the soul who turned silence into sanctuary, didn't just change the world. She retuned it, and it still sings in her tea. The piano sat untouched in the corner of the orphanage's common room, its once polished frame dulled by years of tiny fingerprints and sun-faded memories. No one played it anymore. The tuning had gone, and a few black keys stuck, refusing to rise after being pressed. Children used it more as a hiding place than a home for music, until the day a stranger walked in wearing dust-worn shoes, a linen shawl around her shoulders, and a single silver bell around her wrist. She said nothing at first, just placed her hand gently on the piano lid and smiled. The children watched from a distance, wide-eyed and skeptical. But when she slid onto the bench, her presence drew them in like the slow unfolding of morning. Her fingers didn't strike the keys. They hovered, waited, listened, and then, without ceremony or flair, she played. The melody was soft, familiar to no one and yet known to everyone. It had no name. It wasn't bold or impressive. It was simply kind, like the first hand you ever held, like the hush of a lullaby you couldn't remember until now. The children crept closer. Some sat cross-legged on the tile, others leaned against door frames. She never asked their names. She didn't need to. She had always known how to listen before she spoke. That would be the final recorded sighting of Aria Bellamy. No passports, no tickets, no destination, just music, left behind like footprints in water. No announcement followed, no memorial service, no obituary. Only a silence that fell across the world like snow. And into that silence came echoes, not of her name, but of her voice. Because her music was still everywhere. In the waiting rooms of hospitals, where mothers held premature babies to their chests and whispered lullabies based on the 5-note theme she once played for grief. In subway tunnels, where violinists began their sets not with Bach or Mozart, but with simple, improvised melodies. Music that didn't ask for applause, only for presence. In classrooms, where blind students felt rhythm, not through pages, but through movement and memory, because Aria had shown the world that sound didn't need to be seen to be understood. In nursing homes, where therapists used vibrations and silence to soothe the trembling hands of the elderly. In cities, villages, and corners of the earth untouched by wealth but overflowing with spirit, people began saying her name not as a legend, but as a gesture. They whispered, "Aria," the way one might whisper, "hope." A woman in Palestine named her daughter after her. A monk in Bhutan composed a chant using only the rhythms of breath, calling it the Bellamy chant. In the streets of Harlem, a mural appeared, not of her face, but of a single ear surrounded by swirling colors, painted by children who had only ever heard her in stories. The caption beneath it read, "Listen deeper." At Eastbrook Conservatory, now utterly transformed, the Bellamy Wing opened its doors to a new generation. It welcomed students with no formal training, no reading ability, no traditional language. It accepted applications submitted through humming, tapping, and even silence. In the center of its atrium stood no statue, just a grand piano surrounded by empty chairs. Visitors were encouraged not to watch, but to sit, to join, to remember that music was never meant to be distant. And on the wall behind the piano, engraved in stone, were the final words she had once whispered to a girl who didn't know how to begin. "If you can hear it, it already belongs to you." One day, a young student named Noor, blind since birth, walked into that space holding her mother's hand. She had never touched a piano before, never believed she could. But she had read a story about a girl who once sat in hallways and listened through walls. She approached the keys slowly, traced them, trembled, and played a note. Just one. But the sound that followed didn't come from the piano. It came from every person who heard her. It came from within. And though Noor never knew it, she had begun her own story that day. Because that's what Aria had left the world. Not just a legacy, not just compositions, but permission. Permission to play without perfection, to hear without judgment, to create without apology, to exist in all the broken, beautiful, untrained messiness of being human, and still call it music. In a distant canyon where wind still curls through hollow stone, if you sit long enough you might hear a soft echo. Not a voice, not a song, just a resonance, a presence, as if someone once sat there, played, listened, and left behind a silence that sings. That's where she is now. Not gone, just everywhere we choose to listen. And the next time you hear a child hum to themselves beneath the noise of the world, or an old man tap a beat onto his coffee cup when no one's watching, or you catch yourself breathing in rhythm without knowing why, stop. Be still. And remember the blind girl they once mocked, who played one note and silenced the world. She never sought fame, never demanded recognition, never fought for a stage. Yet Aria Bellamy transformed the world one silent note at a time. Mocked for her blindness, dismissed before she ever touched the keys, she didn't just prove them wrong. She redefined what it meant to hear. Her legacy was not in the thunder of applause, but in the quiet places where music had been forgotten. And long after the lights faded and the critics stopped speaking, her melodies kept breathing. Through children, through silence, through every soul brave enough to listen. Because in the end, she didn't play to impress the world. She played to wake it.